Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the New Jersey STEM Pathways Network webinar series. I am Kim Case. I am the manager of the New Jersey STEM Pathways Network, and I want to welcome you to a great webinar that we have for you today on the New Jersey Student Learning Assessments. We do have a fantastic guest speaker for you, Dr. Bari Erlichson. Before we jump right into our content, I just want to do a couple of quick announcements for everybody. As most of you know, March is New Jersey STEM Month, and we just have several opportunities and resources available to anyone who would like to use them. Almost all of these resources are on the New Jersey STEM Pathways website, which is NJSPN.org, and I'm going to put that in the chat box. So we do frequent updates on New Jersey STEM Month via webinars. So our next webinar is actually January 25th from 12 to 1 p.m. So if you want to get some updates and resources on New Jersey STEM Month, you can join that webinar. It's listed on our event calendar on our website. Again, in regards to the calendar, you are allowed to add whatever events for the month of March in regards to STEM. So you can go to the website and add any events that you have related to STEM for the month of March. Caveat also, you can do that all year long, but we do want to populate the calendar as much as we can for the month of March. We are going to be doing a mini grant announcement this month. So in the next week or so, we will be giving away up to $10,000 in mini grants around the state, and that's going everywhere from school districts to museums to professional organizations and libraries. So stay tuned for those announcements. We recently created several STEM awards, and that nomination form will also be available. If you sign up for our listserv, that's probably the easiest way to get all of this information, and you can do that on our website, njstempathways.org. And the STEM awards will also be listed on our website. And that's a great way to acknowledge your colleagues, any funders, or people in your network who are supporting STEM. There's several different awards, so you can check out all the different categories. March 1st is the STEM Month kickoff, so that will be at NJIT. That's our next quarterly meeting for the STEM Pathways Network, and it's in the morning around 9:30 to 12. And then lastly, we will be at the State House on March 25th. And if anybody would like to join us, there's also a form that you could fill out. Unfortunately, we don't have space for everybody, but we are asking people to submit if they have some interest in attending that. People have brought students in the past. Obviously, they have informational material they can hand out. So you can check out the form if you're interested and submit that. The sooner the better, because that's going to be a rolling process. In regards to STEM Month or the New Jersey STEM Pathways Network, I'm happy to answer any of those questions. I'm going to put my email in the chat box so people can email me directly. And I want to jump right into introducing Dr. Bari Erlichson. Dr. Erlichson has a bachelor's degree in political science and government from Dartmouth. She has several degrees from Stanford University, including a master's in political science and government and educational leadership, as well as a PhD in political science and government, again, all from Stanford. She's held many positions in education, both in and out of the classroom. Notably, she was an assistant commissioner at the Department of Education in the Division of Data, Research, Evaluation, and Reporting. And I got a very quick Excel spreadsheet lesson from her a couple months ago, and she is the best of the best. And she also was a special assistant to the commissioner. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Erlichson.
Thank you very much for that introduction. And March sounds like a lot of fun. My hope today is to provide folks with an overview of how the state assesses science learning and how the data from those assessments can be used to support instruction in our classroom. So here's the overall agenda. We're going to start by talking about how the student learning standards are structured in science and in English language arts. Then we'll talk about the New Jersey Student Learning Assessment in Science. Some of you are probably really aware that the state is transitioning from PARCC to new student learning assessments in the spring, or should I say newish. And then I want to talk a little bit about how the data from the English language arts assessments support science instruction, which is perhaps not as well known as I hope it would be. So to start with, you know, this is how the state and how most educators sort of understand and visualize the relationship between what the state does with its standards, their local curriculum, local instruction and pedagogy, and then the assessments. What I want you to take away from this particular slide is that what's in the red ink is a state level action. So in the portion of this, the standards portion, standards are adopted by the New Jersey State Board of Education. And they specify what we think students should know and be able to do. And New Jersey has had a long history with standards. They started in the Whitman administration in 1996 with the core curriculum content standards. What's in black ink is locally determined. So although the state says this is what students should know and be able to do, what instructional materials and what kind of pedagogy and instructional approaches are taken to that end are local decisions. So in New Jersey, textbooks, online resources, all of those things are adopted by local school boards. There are about 30 states across the country for whom those decisions are more guided by the state level. About a dozen states have state level adoptions of textbooks, and another 18 or so states say these are the recommended, you need to choose from this list. So New Jersey places more local control in school districts around those issues. The state also does have state level assessments like PARCC or Access for ELS or WIDA that are summative. But again, there are locally adopted assessments that are the discretion of school districts. So what's in red is state level, what's in black is local. So this is the way that it sort of works itself out. So I chose a math standard here. So this is the New Jersey Student Learning Standard in grade 3. That little code at the bottom says grade 3, operations and algebraic instruction, and then the actual is C7. And this standard is fluently multiply and divide within 100. So then the kinds of decisions that a local school district would make around curriculum is, where does this topic fall in our course design? How long do we teach it? What instructional materials do we use? And then in the pedagogy, how should we teach the standard? You know, how do we approach it? Is it a rote memorization? Is it about games? Is it included in the homework? And then the local assessments, you know, teacher written materials, and then this is a standard that would be assessed as part of the PARCC math test. So the next generation science standards sort of changed the approach to thinking about standards in New Jersey. We used to have very specific grade level standards, and the next generation science standards, in seeking to be more coherent, organized themselves across 3 disciplinary areas with grade band endpoints in earth-based science, life science, and physical science. So much like what the Common Core attempted to do with math in terms of focusing on a limited number of topics and emphasizing practice, the science standards also took that approach. Let's be clear about the number of topics, but let's also make sure that our science instruction includes a deep emphasis on scientific method and practice. So this is what it kind of looks like in terms of the disciplinary core idea of progression. So this is just page 1 of the Earth-Space Science progression. The idea is that the first column is grades K to 2, followed by grades 3 to 5, 6 to 8, 9 to 12, and then the idea of the earth science area, the universe and its stars. The purpose of these kind of grade spans is that students will learn parts of the universe and stars as developmentally appropriate in each sort of grade span. So you can see how the grade banding of the topics became more important to the implementation of the next generation science standards. It's kind of similar in our approach to English language arts in reading. So in reading, there are sort of 10 core ideas, if you will. We call them anchor standards in reading. And the idea is that this first anchor standard, read closely to determine what the text says explicitly, that students are exposed as developmentally appropriate to that standard in every grade level as they move through the K-12 system. So the idea would be that, in grade 1, the text is obviously much more simple than it would be in grade 12, but the idea is that the students have exposure to these standards throughout. What's new in our standards now, and this is again in 3rd grade reading, is this notion that we approach the teaching of these standards both through literature, that's on the left side of this chart, right, fiction, and then, I'm sorry, on the left side of the chart, and then on the right side of the chart, this notion that we are introducing students to informational texts along the way as well, having them engage in nonfiction. And as you'll see later, there's a great deal of science that is brought in now. This is one of the key major shifts between where we were with the core curriculum content standards to the Common Core, and then ultimately to the New Jersey Student Learning Standards. So prior to, say, 2010, we were not doing as much work with complex text and explicitly studying the academic language of content of the complex text. So this was some of the major shifts that, and one of the reasons why implementing English language arts standards was a tall order to a lot of school districts. So we now are engaged in regular practice with the complex text. We are seeking to have our students ground their reflections of reading and writing and in speaking in the evidence from text, both the literature and informational. And we are also more explicitly seeking to build knowledge through content-rich nonfiction. That last bullet is a major change. The idea that students need to build knowledge early on in their experience in school, as they're building their literacy skills, that knowledge and literacy are codependent, if you will. So in thinking about our science assessments, I just wanted to toss out, this is the statewide assessment calendar. You can see kind of in the 5th or 6th row down that the science assessments are both in elementary, middle, and high school. They begin this year on May 6th, and they end on June 7th. Now, that's the testing window. A lot of people have misinterpreted that to believe that that's the number of days that we test. No, the test itself can be done in about 2 days, but there's a big window that allows for schools and districts to schedule the assessments in ways that make sense. The science assessments are online now. They use the same test platform as the PARCC assessments did. So there's some synergy around that for the adult administrators and even for the students to be testing on the same platform. But yeah, so there's a lot of flexibility because many school districts still struggle with availability of the computers. So we piloted our new assessments in the spring of 2018 that are aligned to the next generation science standards to capture the student learning at the end of the grade band. So prior to 2018, we had students testing at the end of grade 4, at the end of grade 11, and an end of course biology assessment. I should mention that the federal government, as part of No Child Left Behind, and now as part of the Every Student Succeeds Act, requires states to test at least once in the elementary grade levels, once in the middle grade levels, and once in the high school grade levels. So the tests that we have are meant to fulfill those requirements. So moving to the next generation science standards required us to also be thoughtful about how we support the implementation of those standards, which required the shift. So shifting from grades 4 to grade 5 last year meant that that the students who were in grade 4 in 2017 were then tested again in the spring of 2018 as 5th graders. That caused a little bit of consternation. Moving from a 9th grade biology test, most of our students in New Jersey are taking a course called biology as freshmen in high school, to an end of grade level, grade 11 test in science also caused a bit of consternation as folks believe that grade 11 is one of the highly tested grade levels because of all of the college entrance requirements and advanced placement and international baccalaureate assessments. But I'm hoping that you can see that the purpose in making those shifts around those grade levels was to be in alignment with how the standards are organized by grade bands. So this is a sample test question for 5th grade. So I picked this one because it's a little bit innovative. It's a multiple choice question. You can see on the right side of the screen that there are check boxes, but it has 2 valid statements. So the idea is that rather than engaging in sort of the traditional test besting behaviors of determining, which one is absolutely wrong, and then sort of keep moving until you are able to guess, when you have 2 or more valid statements or correct answers, it forces students to kind of engage in the question of whether each one of the questions could possibly be true. Inside the test platform, just as kind of a quirky thing, if there is more than one correct answer, the selection is a box. If there's only one correct answer, the selection is a circle. We do have trouble with students, particularly the student that currently lives in my house, my son, who don't read the stems of the questions. And so that can be something that trips students up if they're not prepared by moving to sort of the more sophisticated testing. So this is the idea that there's data presented graphically, and the students need to interact with that. This is also an example test question from the 5th grade test. I love it, being someone who's deeply engaged in data analysis. The idea that students need to be able to read the table and be able to understand the table and choose, analyze it and synthesize. So this is an example of an open-ended response. So down and on the right side of the screen where it says choose 2 solutions for reducing deer population and explain why. This is this example of where students would need to construct a response and support their answers. And then the last part of this is, explain why the other 2 solutions would be less effective. So this is a really, really meaty kind of question where there's the analysis, the synthesis, and sort of the reporting out, as well as the justification. And keep in mind, this is 5th grade. So this is, there's a lot of good things going on in this type of question that obviously we can't get to in multiple choice only tests. In thinking about what the state's embarking on to transition from PARCC to our new New Jersey Student Learning Assessment. So you'll notice that there's a common title now, New Jersey Student Learning Assessments. There's the NJSLA Science, the NJSLA English Language Arts, the NJSLA Math. So the first thing is obviously, as I just mentioned, this new name. The PARCC Consortium was funded by the federal government and the Obama administration, and it was a group of states that came together to write tests in English Language Arts and in math. As most of you are probably aware, that money ultimately ran out, and so the PARCC Consortium as an entity ceased to exist. There's a lot of noise about how many states are left as PARCC states, and that's not really a fair way of talking about it, because the consortium ceased to exist at the end of the federal grant period. I would venture that all of the former PARCC states are still using PARCC content, even as they have done what New Jersey is doing and renaming the assessments to be based on local decision making. So the assessments are renamed, and the test time has been reduced in language arts from 3 to 2 units, in elementary math from 4 units to 3 units, in middle school math reducing the unit times from 80 minutes to 60 minutes, and in Algebra 1 reducing from 3 to 2. This chart here around testing times was just released from the State Department, I would say maybe a week or 2 ago, certainly in the month of January. It's a shame I'm already losing time, losing count of the time in the academic calendar. So, the testing times are meant to be sufficient, so that students don't feel like the time itself is a variable in their performance. So these should be ample, even in their reduced time. So there they are on the left side of the column, 75 minutes for Unit 1 in ELA, moving all the way down to ELA tests in grade 6 through ELA 11, the 90-minute times. Test times in language arts tend to be a little bit more meaty, because we expect students to read independently 2 or 3 different pieces of text, and then to write replies to those. So it requires some effort and time for students to engage in the text, synthesize their ideas, draft or craft a response, and then actually type. Some students work through that with graphical organizers that they can paper and pencil. There are tools inside the test platform that allow students to draft and annotate. And you can see all the way on the right side of the screen the testing times for the science assessments. The test times for grade 5, I believe, have increased since the pilot in 2018. I believe that the state got some feedback that grade 5 students were seeming a bit rushed. You'll notice that the units, are independently, in the high school are 60 minutes and then another 60 minutes. And so many high schools and even middle schools approach this by stacking the units. So the idea would be that the class would take the 60 minutes, get up, take a break, and then take unit 2, and then on the second day come back and take unit 3, take a break, and come back and take unit 4. So those kinds of questions are left to the discretion of school districts. Some school districts go at this pretty aggressively and will do, a week of testing where day 1 would, in say the middle school, would be ELA, right? In the morning do unit 1, in the afternoon do unit 1 in math. in the morning, and the second day do unit 2 of ELA, and the afternoon do unit 3 of, so do unit 2 of math. So there's a lot of discretion available to the to school districts in a way that the paper-based testing under NJSPN and HESPA didn't allow. This is an overview of a presentation made to the State Board of Education in August. I think you can see the date in the header on the right. So August 1st, State Board meeting. The folks who have the contract for the spring assessment came in and took and went through the changes that they're making from the 2018 PARCC assessments to the New Jersey Learning Assessments for 2019. And essentially, what you can see is that they took the longer form of the 2018 test, and they're taking a subset of that to make the short form for 2019. They're still maintaining a strong coverage of all of New Jersey's standards. They still have the integrated language arts tasks that we've had in the past. The math tasks are going to continue to measure students' mathematical reasoning. So what you can take away from the third and fourth bullet is that the students' constructed response, the idea that students will need to solve type 2 or type 3 questions in math, those constructed response test questions, and also the writing tasks in English language arts still remain. The fifth bullet is saying that the test maintains the scale that's benchmarked to college and career readiness. So essentially, in the 2018 assessment, if a student met level 4, we call them meeting expectations. And what they're saying is that 2019 will have a similar cut score, so that meeting expectations on the long form of the test is going to be the same as meeting expectations on the short form of the test. But most importantly is this last bullet, which says that that they've maintained the comparability back to the first year of PARCC, so the 2015 baseline. So what you can take away from this is that the 2019 data can be compared to the 2018, to the 2017, to the 2016, and this is really important. This kind of year-over-year comparison, because it'll give schools and districts the opportunity to continue to measure their progress against the first year of testing. Now, how could New Meridian accomplish all of that as fast as they did? They've been working with the state as well as the other PARCC states to implement short forms across the last several years. Colorado embarked on this as well, and so they have already done sort of a bunch of external research and validation from the Center for Improved Educational Assessments and PARCC's own Technical Assistance Committee. So how does PARCC support STEM learning? And this is kind of complex for those of you who've never seen it before. And this is not a public report. This is a report that goes out through the Pearson Access Next platform that all school districts have access to. So let me go slowly through what you're looking at. The first thing to understand is that when developing the assessment, we took the standards and broke them down into measurable chunks. So, and then when we got down to those measurable chunks, we wrote test questions on them. So sometimes a standard may have been, that students will be able to do X and Y. And in order to measure that standard, we had to write test questions that were about X and then other test questions that were about Y. And when you get down to that level of granularity and say, this is a test question about X, that's called an evidence statement. So it's a pretty granular level, and we can talk about how students did on X inside, say, operations and algebraic thinking versus how they did on Y inside operations and algebraic thinking. So the evidence statements get very granular. And so what you're looking at here, you'll see in the blue numbering, you're looking at 34 evidence statement analyses that are associated with 6th grade language arts and literacy standards. So the left side, top left, English language arts literacy, grade 6 assessment, and this is from last spring. Just continuing down here, this is a school district that had 72 valid test scores in grade 6. The coding, the red triangles, are all of the students from across, we call them cross-state analyses. These are park states or former park states, however we care to think about it, who took the particular evidence statement, took the test question that measured that. So those are the cross-state analyses. The blue square is New Jersey. And in this instance, the circle is this particular district. It always bugs me that the red triangle and the blue square are connected with a line, because this is not a line graph. And I appreciate that some of you may be as stickly about this as I am, since we talk about precision in science, because it's not about these standard evidence statement number 1 is not necessarily related to evidence statement number 1 and 2, rather, in a linear way. So that's the way to look at the pieces of data. So what are we looking at in terms of the y-axis here? So the idea is that in evidence statement number 1, which is a reading literature grade 6, anchor standard 9, subpart 1, that's the 6.9.1, that on average in New Jersey, that students got about 19% of the possible points associated with the reading literature anchor standard 9 question. You'll note that this district is not on the chart. This district did not have enough students take that particular test question in order to register. So then the second, right, the district got about 21% of the possible points associated with evidence statement number 2, which is reading informational text anchor standard 9. So RL, reading literature, RI, reading informational text. The evidence statements are organized on the x-axis from left to right in order of difficulty, which again is kind of a shorthand. It's because difficulty is measured by what the overall average percent correct. So the first evidence statement over here is the one that has the least percent correct, and then number 34 over on the right side is the one that has the most percent correct, the most possible point percentage of the test of the evidence statements correct. On the far right of this chart is how students did in the writing categories. So for instance, that first is written expression or students making an argument. You can see that New Jersey far outpaces the other cross states in written expression, and also in writing knowledge in grade 6. So the cross-state park is probably 22%, and I'd say that the New Jersey is probably about 37%, and being able to construct arguments and be clear throughout. Writing knowledge, New Jersey is probably up at like 48, and the cross-state park comparison was about 37. You know, that's New Jersey as a whole. Our language arts standards have always been very strong and required a great deal of writing from our students. So it's great to see that that is reflected here. And then in the tasks, right, there are in language arts, the students were expected to write 3 different types of tasks. One was in literary analysis, one was a research simulation, and the second was narrative writing. And those are the outcomes. So in the literature analysis, this school, right, was about 38, got about 38% of the possible points in the literature analysis. Okay, so that's the setup. But I wanted you to pay attention specifically to anchor standard number 7, which is denoted with that red arrow. Anchor standard number 7 has a code, RST, which is about the reading of science and scientific texts. So in this particular school, right, this is one of the lowest performing evidence statements. Maybe number 10 is something that we want to take a look at as well. 8 is also a reading of science and technology, and it's, you know, the school is doing pretty well. So this is kind of an outlier that when I took a look at it and I was thinking about talking with you today, I was interested in trying to understand. So the next page of this, you'll see again, I highlighted number 6, which is the reading of science and technical subjects. The last column on that first little chart indicates that all 72 of the students in the district took this particular test question. And so this is fairly robust data. And so when you click through and you find, well, what does that evidence statement mean? And this is the lower box down at the bottom. What we're asking students to do is provide an analysis of the author's purpose in providing an explanation, describing a procedure, or discussing an experiment in a text. So this is obviously a very difficult skill where grade 6 students would need to dive in, need to read science and technical text passage, and be able to talk about how the different parts of that text, the explanation, the overall description of the procedure, how those things furthered the author's purpose. So this is a really, really meaty, very exciting subject. And it's something that traditionally language arts teachers didn't necessarily imagine that they would be doing, reading science and technical texts. And it's also something that science teachers who were deeply engaged in sort of experiments in their classroom may not have stopped to imagine that students need to read write-ups and be able to dissect them. I also wanted to point out that that New Jersey also provides student-level data for these the literacy in science and technical subjects. So this is called a content standards roster. This is identifiable. I put some blurry stuff on here so that you wouldn't see any student names. So this is not something that typically a school district would share with a partnering organization because it does have the student names. So a little bit of orientation to the chart. This is again grade 6 assessment in English language arts and literacy in the 17-18 school year. This is a chart that you can see sort of 4 lines of student data: student number 17, student number 18, student number 19, and student number 20. This is the second page of this report. There's a first page that talks about reading comprehension, but for our purpose, I wanted us to focus and see that there is data provided for how students are tackling specifically the literacy and science and technical subjects. So the way to read this is student number, let's look at the first line that I haven't blurred out. Student number 17 received 38% of the possible points that were available to the student in the literacy and science and technical subjects. Across the state, you'll see that the average was in New Jersey that 42% of the state. So the 6th graders, there are about 100,000 of them that took this assessment in 17-18. when they got to the test questions that were about science and technical subjects across the state, 42% of the question or the possible points were gained by New Jersey students. This individual student got 38%. So this student trails the state in literacy and science and technical subjects by about 4 percentage points. I want you to contrast that with the column immediately to the left, which is the literacy and history and social studies. Now again, across the state, 41% of the possible points were garnered on average by the 6th graders. But this particular student scored 71% of the possible points. So this student has a great deal of capacity in reading, and as demonstrated in the literacy literacy and history and the social sciences. But you can see is dragging compared to the state average in science and technical subjects. So this is a really great example of how student level data could be used to come in and say, all right, well, let's check on the student's exposure to texts that are science and technical, and make sure that we have instructional materials in the classroom, even in the language arts classroom, that would support students' independent reading in science and technology, as well as it being more fully integrated into the actual classrooms. And then I wanted to give you guys a sample test question. So this is from, this is a PARCC test question that's been released publicly, and it's not in its entirety on here, but this is in the standard area of grade 8. So this again is RST 8.5.2. These codes get crazy, I know. And it's grade 8, and you can see it's about tectonics, plate tectonics. So the students would read this passage, and then in part A, right, you can see, as I said, there's those little circles. There's going to be, here's a particular sentence, and then how does this sentence contribute to the reader's understanding of the topic? And so there's one correct answer here. And then part B is which 3 phrases provide examples that further development of the topic in part A. So again, this is, students would need to be able to read all A through G and then select the 3. And you can see again, the text boxes, the selection boxes there are square to help students recognize that there's more than one correct answer. So this is an example of how informational texts have become part of our English language arts standards, part of our testing. And it's a great example of the ways in which we can live the idea that literacy is, in fact, everyone's responsibility across education, and that our science teachers are involved in building that kind of literacy, and our English language arts teachers are also involved in building scientific knowledge by engaging students in building the skills that help them analyze these types of texts. And that brings me to the end.
Great. Thank you so much, Bari. I just wanted to check in. I just put a chat out to everybody to see if people had questions. So if anybody has any questions, you can kind of click on the hand in the control panel on the right side, and we can call on you. We can unmute you. Otherwise, you can chat, do a chat in the box to everybody, and then we can just kind of read that out loud. Okay, so
I think Kathy Greaves' hands up by accident, but I think, so Kathy, if you can unraise your hand and then re-raise it if you really have a question. I think Jeff, did you have a question?
Yeah, it looks like Jeff is trying to have a question.
Can we get a...
You're unmuted. Can you hear us?
Yeah, sure. Could we get a copy of the presentation?
Sure. I'd be happy to provide one.
How do we provide you an email address, or how do we do that?
We have everybody's information from the webinar, so we'll distribute it that way.
Wonderful, thank you.
You're welcome. I have a question from Beverly Plain. And Beverly, when we unmute you, just just let us know where you're from.
I'm sorry, I do not have a question. Thank you.
Okay, no problem.
We have a couple questions that we can read, actually. So there's one here for you, Bari, that says, when you said that you can baseline the data to 2015, not every student took the park, then how will the data be compared?
So the tests were rolled out in 2015, and there were, across the state, there were some, particularly high schools, that had lower levels of participation. And so for those high schools, comparing to 2015 is harder because the participation was lower. So in those instances, I would suggest to those high schools that they compare to 2016 or 2017 as a baseline. Participation rates in elementary and middle schools were typically pretty good, and so meaning that they met the federal requirement of 95% participation. And so those particular data points, I wouldn't hesitate to compare 2019 outcomes to. Now it's true that students age into testing. So when you do year-over-year outcomes, you have to be sensitive to the fact that you're not necessarily comparing. When you compare grade 3 2015 to grade 3 2019. If your school has undergone some significant demographic shifts or grade level shifts or catchment zones have been changed, there are valid reasons why those year-over-year comparisons probably don't work. But at a student level, Park is vertically aligned, so it would be possible to compare kind of a student, say, reading scale score from 2015 to 2016 to 2017 to 2018.
Got it. It's Bari, it's Kim. I'm just wondering, what are the best, resources for school districts, along this line and interpreting data and relating it to New Jersey learning assessments? Are there good resources out there? Is there good teacher professional development that people can look into?
Most of what's being provided to teachers is coming from their local school districts. So there are districts that have undertaken, a professional learning community around this type of data. There are organizations like the New Jersey Principals and Supervisors Association. They host these kinds of things. I teach a class, just a personal plug. I teach a class in analyzing data like this for them. There are some supports that are available around the assessments that are part of the New Jersey Department's website. Particularly in the science pages are now pretty good with released practice assessments and things like that. There are no guidelines or supports about interpreting the science data yet because the state hasn't released any of the data in a public way. The other supports I would suggest would be just a quick Google for the Park released test questions, where you can find essentially at this point the entire 2015 test has been released publicly. So you can find the actual test questions that students took in a number since the beginning. There are, in fact, in language arts in particular, also in math, there are examples of student work with notes from the scorers. We call that the annotated work. So you can open it up and see that this is the type of reading response that got full credit versus 3 points versus 2 points versus 0 points. teachers have been using that, again, locally in their professional learning communities to understand what it looks like to meet the full range of standards.
I have another question for you. In your school district example, Bari, could you speculate why that class performed well on the more difficult standards but lagged significantly in the easier standards? It seems counterintuitive.
So I think Greg is asking, let's see if I can move backwards. So here, right, he's pointing out that in some of the places, like evidence statement number 6, the district is actually beating the state, right? So at about 38% correct on reading literature, but that 38%, you know, is above the state. They tend to be, they're pretty close to the state average all the way until maybe evidence statement number 13. And then they start to sort of deviate and do greater distance from the state. And so that's the interpretation of how come they're doing sort of better on the harder versus worse on what are thinking of as the easier standards. And my hypothesis would be that there's just really uneven. So keep in mind first that the first 3 evidence statements we would want to sort of toss out because they're either 0 or about half of the students who are taking them, and there are some other half of the students that are taking some of the other ones down the line. But I would venture that that the students have been tuned to be able to sort of to answer specific types of questions. This strikes me as a school that's doing a tremendous amount of writing, given how high their scores are next to the state over in the writing categories, and that perhaps need to work more on some of the nuances of reading comprehension and text complexity. So I wouldn't be surprised if this is a school that whose instructional materials were not at the text complexity of grade 6, but that they were engaging students with sort of less complex text than grade level text, but they were requiring students to write a lot. And by the way, just, you know, that's tea leaves off of this one chart. So, but that would be the kind of question that I would go to them and ask if that were true.
I see we have Rob Rolling seems to have a question. So Rob, I'm going to unmute you to see if you have a question.
Hi, yeah, my name is Rob Rolling. I'm the K-12 science supervisor and STEM coordinator in Pequannock. And what you shared with us from the language arts data, where they had the evidence statements, I was wondering if you knew that could we expect coming out of this year's test this spring, as a district and then at the building level, will we get evidence statements broken out the same way? And also, will the practices be identified anywhere along the line, like how we're doing as a district and a building, how we're doing on the practice and the next generation evidence statements? Can we expect the data to be broken the same way?
So Rob, let me see if I understand your question. And I think there are two pieces to it. The first question is that, let me rephrase it and see if I got it right. Given that the state's moving to a shorter form, will something like the evidence statement analysis still exist? That's the first question.
Yeah.
And,
yeah, if I could just say, yeah, like the data that you went over in your presentation, like, can we expect the same type of format in relation to science and the evidence statements that are associated with the science standards?
So I do not know. I don't
Okay.
know that the state's going to release the evidence statement analysis like this for science. It's a little, you know, again, you know, the difference is that that these are grade level evidence statements. So I could imagine that the state would release something that is about the overall umbrella grade, core disciplinary or disciplinary core ideas. I'm hoping that that is what comes out of it. If they don't, we should all clamor for that level of data. But the other part of the question that I heard, which I want to make sure I say out loud, is that even though the state's moving to shorter forms in ELA and math, that the evidence statements like this will be present. I've been told that that some of the granularity around the evidence statements is going to be sacrificed because the test is shorter. But we'll still have something like this for language arts and math. But Rob, you asked the second question, and I'm not sure I remember it.
Well, the standards also identify the practices, the science standards. I'm like worried about science and concerning myself with like what kind of data am I going to get to be able to analyze how we're doing as a district and at the building levels and stuff like that. And the next generation science standards are broken into practices, the DCIs, the content, disciplinary core ideas, and cross-cutting concepts. I do believe that they'll be assessing the practices. And I just wondered if we would get like a data analysis like the one you shared with us for language arts. Would we get it in relation to the practices along with the evidence statements?
I would, my guess is that there'll be some data around the practices, but I want to not get too enthusiastic about it because measuring practice is very hard. Inside, the math standards, there are mathematical practices that underpin how the pedagogy and content of the course should be delivered, and those are very difficult to come across. So in math, we're able to measure modeling and reasoning, right? So I imagine that kind of assessment will be possible in science, but it won't be the full range of the science practice standards.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, guys, I don't think we have too many other questions. So let's, given that we're at the 1 o'clock time, I just want to thank Dr. Erlichson for being on this call and lending her expertise to the New Jersey STEM Pathways Network and our stakeholders. I want to remind everyone that you always can visit njstempathways.org for information, and please join our listserv so you get information about these webinars and about the things that we're working on. And we will follow up with everyone on the webinar with a quick survey just to get your feedback. Love to hear your thoughts on other webinars and experts we could host. I'm happy to work on that for you guys, as well as providing you with the presentation and obviously the recording so you guys can share it out. So just want to thank everyone for joining us, and I look forward to seeing everybody sometime during STEM month. Thank you.